welcome you. My name is Blair Van Dyke. On behalf of Utah Valley University and the Religious Studies program, you are our most welcomed guests. It's my privilege at this time to introduce to you our keynote speaker today, Dr. Steven Prather. Oh, okay. Good idea. Boyd, who is the director of the program, has asked, and so we will comply. We can have an interreligious dialogue about it. I suppose it would be something not religious, but about seating arrangements as far as dialogue is concerned. Boyd's asked that we scoot in, which if you are of the Mormon tradition, that will be a very familiar with request. I'm not exactly sure how that plays out in mosques around the world, but we do anticipate people coming in between now and the time that Dr. Prothero begins, and possibly even thereafter. Thank you for complying. Dr. Prothero is a professor of religion at Boston University, specializing in American religions. He received a Bachelor's of Arts from Yale, a Master's and Ph.D. from Harvard in the study of religion. He's the author of 6 books. They are on display at the bookstore, which is directly across the hall. And today, during the conference, you can purchase one and all of those books at a 20% discount from the UVU bookstore. His 2 most recent projects are New York Times bestsellers. Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't, and God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. He frequently writes for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today publication, Newsweek. He's been on Oprah, CNN. He's a commentator on all things religious in America. And we are particularly pleased to have him, particularly in light of religious diplomacy and the mosque at ground zero question. Should it or should it not be allowed? And we're looking forward to Dr. Prothero addressing these questions and then having the opportunity to ask him and our other panel members, again, a variety of inquiries that will expand our understanding of some compelling issues on the American religious landscape today. So if you'll join me in welcoming our keynote speaker today, Dr. Steven Prather.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Boyd Peterson and Blair and Brian Birch, and thank you all for coming. I was raised in an Episcopal tradition, and we don't scoot in, so I was impressed to see that that happen here. We hold our ground, you know. Is it too low?
No, it's not loud.
Okay. You want me to just do this? Okay, this will probably come up.
Yeah.
Okay, this will work. This will be fine. You can hear me. If you can't hear me, just wave and I'll talk louder. I want to talk about Mormonism and Islam and the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, but before I start that, I thought I would share with you a piece of religious pop culture, Choose Your Own Religion, the guide for the savvy convert. Do you know this? I've been given this by a couple of my students. So this is if you don't want to get too much detail on Islam and Mormonism, you can just start here, and this is going to kind of tell you, let me see, you kind of twirl it to the right spot. So the part that I find interesting is here are the parts: potential new friends, afterlife promises, accessories and paraphernalia, description, but the part I like is the drawbacks and the perks. That's what my students focus on. So the drawbacks in Mormonism: 10% tithing, marriage and family are eternal, no coffee or tea, polygamy renounced in 1890. The perks are secret rites and handshakes, get to go on 2-year mission, and church president asserts, "We are not weird." And then Islam, for comparative purposes, since that's what we're doing here. Drawbacks: very structured and time-consuming. Many rules, not great for women, tainted by extremists. Perks are clean hands from pre-prayer ablutions, beautiful tiles and mosques, firm belief in only way to live. And then I was intrigued that Sufism gets its own place on the dial. Sufism: drawbacks: hard to know or see knowledge of the unseen, dizziness from whirling dervish practice, ego loss. I like that one, ego loss. Perks: roomy, coffee, trance music, unconditional love. Everywhere you turn, there is God's face. So that's at least interreligious dialogue according to the Choose Your Own Religion Savvy Guide, the guide for the savvy convert. So Mormonism and Islam have a history, and in the United States at least, the history is long. As you heard yesterday from Blair Van Dyke, almost from the beginning, Mormonism was being called the Islam of America and a second Mohammedanism. As early as 1831, Joseph Smith was being called the Ontario Muhammad, and later he was called the American Muhammad. Brigham Young, too, was called the second Muhammad of American Mohammedanism. Observers noticed the parallels between Mormonism and Islam: a prophet, an angel, revelation, new scripture, and with it a new religion of sorts, and of course the polygamy connection. Meanwhile, there was the flight of the Mormons from persecution in the East to freedom in the West, portrayed not only as a kind of exodus, in other words, read not only through the Hebraic tradition, but also as a kind of flight, or hijrah, Muhammad's flight from persecution in Mecca to Medina. And these comparisons were a staple of Christian critics of Mormonism, who knew that any similarities they could draw between the LDS Church and Islam would cast Mormons in a bad light. For example, an 1851 article that referred to Joseph Smith as the Yankee Muhammad denounced Smith and Muhammad alike for deceit and for demagoguery. But Mormons got into the act themselves. In fact, during the Mormon War of 1838, in a controversial quote some of you may have heard, Joseph Smith supposedly said, "I will be to this generation a second Muhammad, whose motto entreating for peace was the Al-Quran or the sword. So shall it eventually be with us, Joseph Smith, or the sword," a declaration that some critics of Mormonism have read as a declaration of a kind of Mormon jihad. In my most recent book, God is Not One, I argued against the view that the great religions are different paths up the same mountain. I don't believe that the differences between Christianity and Buddhism, or Hinduism and Islam, or Islam and Mormonism are inessential. On the contrary, I think they're foundational. And I think they go beyond the irreconcilable truth claim differences, doctrinal differences that Dr. Paul just pointed out. They extend to myths, to rituals, to experiences. The different religions, in my view, attack different problems. Each of them starts with the idea that something's gone awry with the world, but they come up with very different understandings of the human predicament. And so naturally they offer different solutions to the human problem. From the very beginning, in other words, they start out going in very different directions. Christians see sin as the problem. They try to eradicate it through salvation, through methods such as faith or works or some combination of the two. Buddhists see the human problem not as sin, but as suffering. They seek an eradication of suffering in nirvana via meditation or some other spiritual experiences or gnosis, knowledge. Muslims, in my view, see the problem as pride, a problem that we saw just in the text from the Quran, the pride of Satan, the pride of all of us, imagining that we can live self-sufficiently without God. And so they submit to God and seek peace on earth and paradise after through submission. So I'm not an all religions are one kind of guy, but it still has to be said that the parallels between Islam and the LDS tradition are striking. Each has its roots in the calling of a new prophet who brings into the world a new revelation that is written down in new scripture. Each features intrepid followers who turn that revelation into a global religious force. Each builds on the scriptures and traditions of Judaism and Christianity, giving Jesus a central place in its story. Each is a patriarchal religion that emphasizes the role of family. Each forbids alcohol. Each has a polygamous past that goes back to founder. Each insists that its founder is not God. Islam is not Mohammedanism. Mormonism is not Joseph Smithism, as it was called sometimes in the middle of the 19th century. Nonetheless, each sees the words and actions of its founder as authoritative. There's a sunnah of sorts of Joseph Smith, and just as the words of Muhammad are collected in the Hadith literature, the teachings of Smith are collected in Mormon scriptures, some of which we just heard read. In Mormonism, WWJD can refer either to what would Jesus do or what would Joseph do, or both. Finally, each of these founders suffered, each of these traditions suffered through a crisis of succession after the death of its founder and wrestled in the process with whether leadership should pass down through the prophet's family, as in the RLDS and the Shia, or whether the successor should be, as it were, the best available draft pick. Nonetheless, the differences are considerable, and they begin, as do the differences between Mormonism and the traditional Christian creeds, with understandings of God. I'm not a theologian. I always point this out whenever any theological thought is discussed in my presence. But suffice it to say that Mormon beliefs in the corporality of God, the plurality of gods, the eternal progression of humans into godhood are not only foreign to Islam, but anathema to it, kind of blasphemy, as we heard, or unbelief, perhaps even shirk. While Muslims, like Jews and Calvinists, see something like an infinite qualitative distinction between God and human beings, Mormons typically collapse that gap. The oft-quoted words of LDS President Lorenzo Snow, "As man now is, God was, as God now is, man may become," would never be uttered by a Muslim. Although each builds on Judaism and Christianity, Mormons accept the Christian Bible as scripture, while Muslims argue that the Jewish and Hindu scriptures are too corrupted to be considered scripture, at least in their available forms. Muslims, of course, see Muhammad as the final prophet, the seal of the prophets. Mormons believe not only that Joseph Smith was a prophet, but that prophecy is ongoing. Despite these differences, Mormons and Muslims share an American history. Both have been feared and reviled. In A Nation of Religions, a book that I edited a few years ago, University of Virginia professor James Davison Hunter, who authored a book some of you might have read on the culture wars, argued that new religions in America typically go through 4 different stages. Those stages are introduction, where the religion exists as a kind of niche market on the edge of a dominant religious environment. Recognition, the assertion of identity, looking to be seen by a wider public. Third, negotiation. And fourth, if the negotiations are successful, establishment as a legitimate form of American religion. The hard part, of course, occurs between recognition and establishment, since that's where the persecution sets in. In the book, talks to some extent about that with Muslims, with Sikhs, with Buddhists, and with Hindus. For Mormons, the introduction period in America was short to the point of non-existent, and the negotiation particularly long and often venomous and even murderous. Even before the Book of Mormon was published, it was being denounced as a fraud, and such are the vagaries of religious invention in the modern world. For much of their first century, of course, Mormons were denounced as dangerously un-American. So the traditional story of the LDS in the American imagination says that Mormons were reviled from the 1830s until the 1890s, when church leaders agreed to jettison two practices that most disturbed their fellow Americans, practice of polygamy and the rejection of sorts of church-state separation in so-called theocracy. And after that, according to this dominant narrative, it was relatively smooth sailing. We go from the assassination of Joseph Smith to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir to Donnie and Marie, the reality show stardom of David Archuleta of American Idol, and other Mormon contestants on Dancing with the Stars and Biggest Loser. I think that was another Mormon success story. So today the Mormons are quintessentially American, more American than I am, perhaps, given my residence in the irredeemably liberal state of Massachusetts. According to this now canonical narrative, Mormonism moves quickly from introduction to negotiation. It then negotiates very successfully, jettisoning polygamy and theocracy in exchange for statehood and respectability, and quickly earns as a result legitimation as an authentic American religion, indeed, according to some, the quintessential American religion. But a dissertation in progress by a graduate student of mine, Christine Hutchison-Jones, calls that rosy story into question. Mormon bashing did not come to an end in the 1890s, she argues. In fact, she sees it as a trope that continues to this day. According to recent polls, many Americans, roughly a quarter, say they would not vote for an otherwise qualified Mormon for U.S. president. Still, I think her pessimism is a bit overdrawn. There are 15 Mormons in the U.S. Congress, and in many respects, Mormons are seen, in my view, at least through much of America, with the exclusion of Boston, Cambridge, and San Francisco, as a model minority. Islam has not fared anywhere near as well in the American imagination. When we think of Mormons today, we think of Mitt Romney and Harry Reid and Donnie and Marie. When we think of Muslims, we think of Osama bin Laden. Islam has been largely invisible through most of American history. Thomas Jefferson owned a Quran, the very Quran that Representative Keith Ellison of Minnesota was sworn in as America's first Muslim member of Congress. But there was no widespread public conversation about Islam, nothing to parallel the 19th century conversation about Mormonism until the 1960s, and Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and the Nation of Islam. And since then, any recognition that Muslims have achieved has been decidedly negative and even horrifying at times. The Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, Ayatollah Khomeini, 9/11, Osama bin Laden. Immediately after 9/11, there were major efforts to integrate Islam into the pantheon of American religions, to leverage the Judeo-Christian tradition into the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, to push Islam from recognition and negotiation very quickly into legitimation and establishment. President Bush spoke repeatedly of Islam as a religion of peace, and no interfaith service was worthy of that name for the first few years after 9/11 if it did not include an imam. But Islam has not yet achieved the sort of legitimation that Mormonism has enjoyed. Republicans angling for the White House feel no compunction about denouncing Islam as a dangerous religion. In fact, it's a useful rhetoric to engage in. Many Americans don't see any problem with efforts to stop Muslims in New York City from building a Muslim community center in Lower Manhattan. And just yesterday, of course, the New York Republican Peter King held hearings on the radicalization of Islam in America in Washington, D.C. You might think that the history of Mormon persecution in the United States would have led Mormons to speak out early and often on behalf of the civil liberties of Muslims. Japanese Buddhists, mindful of another ugly moment in American history, FDR's signing of Executive Order 9066 in 1942, which created internment camps for Japanese Americans during World War II, into which the first people who went were Buddhists, and particularly Buddhist priests, an action that essentially interned the entire community of American Buddhists in camps. Their descendants, and some of them themselves, spoke out forcefully and en masse for Muslims after 9/11. But Mormons have been conspicuously silent in recent weeks and months. This is this tricky thing here where you can't see the clock at all from where I am. I have to have my Episcopal sense of an hour. In the Episcopal tradition, for those of you who don't know, the church service ends between 59 minutes and 30 seconds and 60 minutes and 2 seconds, because if it goes to 60 minutes and 3 seconds, everyone gets up and leaves, or fires the priest. Yesterday in Religion Dispatch's online website, Joanna Brooks, a Mormon, wrote that as a Mormon, she found the King hearings particularly objectionable because Mormons of all people know what it feels like, and I'm quoting her, for an entire religion to be publicly demeaned for the objectionable deeds of its minorities. And because our religion too was once put on trial by Congress. She was referring, of course, to the Smoot Hearings, which prevented a duly elected LDS church leader, Reed Smoot, from taking his seat in the U.S. Senate for 4 years. The hearings went on from 1904 to 1907. He finally was seated, and I believe he served for 30 years. It was a success story in that regard. But during those hearings, as Brooke writes, effort was not only to prevent Smoot from taking his seat, but also to put every dimension of Mormon life under national scrutiny, just as we're now looking at the dimensions of Muslim life in America. But there has been no Mormon choir joining Brooks in denouncing recent outrages against Islam in America. In fact, she's something of a voice crying in the Mormon wilderness. When America's leading Republicans started to ratchet up the rhetoric over the Islamic Community Center and Mosque near Ground Zero, I immediately thought that my former governor, Mitt Romney, might distinguish himself from other Republicans by speaking out for religious freedom and the Park 51 project. In 2007, when he was running for the Republican nomination for president, Romney gave a speech that I had described in print at the time as an instant classic in American civil religion. I loved the speech. It was called Faith in America. And in that speech, he spoke glowingly of religious liberty and the separation of church and state. He said that he himself had learned much, not only from Catholics, evangelicals, and Jews, but also from, and I quote, the commitment to frequent prayer of the Muslims. Romney also chastised early Americans for failing to live up to the promises of the First Amendment, where Reagan had referred to this country as a shining city on the hill for all the world to see, conjuring that famous sermon on the Arabella by Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts. Romney said it was important to remember that the United States has also been a place of religious bigotry, something you hardly ever hear from any politician, particularly from the Republican side. The Puritans arrived in the New World seeking religious liberty, he said, but upon finding it for themselves, they denied it to others. This bigotry exiled Anne Hutchinson from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it drove Brigham Young and other pioneering Mormons onto their westward trek to Utah. For Romney, the moral of this history lesson was clear. Americans should today rise above religious bigotry, not least by evaluating presidential candidates on the basis of their credentials instead of their religious tradition. After all, Romney said, religious tolerance would be a shallow principle indeed if it were reserved only for faiths with which we agree. So here he was doing this wonderfully intriguing dance of conjuring the JFK speech that John F. Kennedy made while he was running for president in Texas, when Kennedy made the now astonishing but then important claim that his Catholicism would affect absolutely nothing he ever did or thought as president of the United States. Something that now would immediately ensure you're losing any effort to become president, but at the time was important for Kennedy in order for him to even be considered. He had to essentially say that faith doesn't matter, my faith doesn't matter, whereas now Democrats and Republicans alike need to say that their faith does in fact matter. So these were the words, Romney's speech, his 2007 speech on faith in America, that came to me when Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin and other Republican leaders started to double down on the anti-Islamic rhetoric as the debate over the Park 51 project in Lower Manhattan turned from a matter of a local zoning board to a matter of national and even international conflict. I thought at the time that Romney, as a Mormon, might speak out passionately for the First Amendment. I thought he might remember how the founder of his religion, Joseph Smith, had been murdered by an anti-Mormon mob. I thought he might recall how the US government brought down so much of its coercive power against the LDS Church in the last decades of the 19th century. But unfortunately, he did not. A spokesperson for Romney issued a statement on August 10th saying Romney opposes the construction of the mosque at Ground Zero. The wishes of the families of the deceased and the potential for extremists to use the mosque for global recruiting and propaganda compel rejection of this site. Not long after that statement appeared, Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid, also a Mormon, opened the floodgates for what would become a steady stream of Democratic equivocation on this important issue, equivocation driven by the realities of the 2010 election cycle. First Amendment protects freedom of religion, Reid's spokesperson Jim Manley said in an August 16 statement. Senator Reid respects that, but thinks that the mosque should be built someplace else. Unfortunately, one of the realities of robust religious liberty in the United States is that members of minority religions grow complacent over the years. When Catholics see Muslims denounced as dangers to America, foreigners who are following dictates of foreign law, who want to impose so-called Sharia on Nebraska? Is that where you guys are trying to impose Sharia law? I'm forgetting. I think Nebraska is the latest one. All too often, they, Catholics, think them rather than us, forgetting the burning of their convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1834 by anti-Catholic mobs. When Mormons see Muslims as a group found guilty of the atrocities of September 11, 2001, all too often they think them rather than us, forgetting how Mormons as a group were found guilty of the atrocities of September 11th, another September 11th, 1857, when Mormon vigilantes attacked a wagon train of Arkansas immigrants to the Utah Territory, killing some 120 men, women, and children. So perhaps I'm wrong for holding Mormons to a higher standard, but I do. I believe that members of a religious group that has been persecuted almost to extinction should stand up and speak out when Newt Gingrich starts to liken Muslims to Nazis and Tea Party advocates start referring to Islam as a cult. At a minimum, religious minorities should not fall into the Puritan trap of demanding religious freedom for themselves while denying it to others. That's why I found the opposition of Abraham Foxman in the Anti-Defamation League to the Park 51 project so dispiriting, and why I found the statements of Reid and Romney both sad and shameful. Roughly a decade ago, there was a big controversy in Massachusetts concerning a proposed Mormon temple in Belmont. The site was literally in the neighborhood of Romney's family and their residence in Belmont. and it was to serve a congregation that Romney himself led as bishop in the 1980s, and a stake that he served as president in the late 80s and early 90s. Local residents opposed just about everything about the temple, including its height, which turned out to be the big legal question, and the customary spire with the angel on the top. But the Mormons and the Constitution won, and the temple was dedicated for use in 2000. Mitt Romney knew this when he was thinking about the Park 51 project. He knew the ways in which minority religions have to fight just literally to get space in America, much less to practice their faith. So my point is that anti-Mormonism is not just ancient history, which is why I found the denunciation of the mosque by Reed surrogates and Romney surrogates so troubling and disappointing. And the same for that supposed paragon of American values and pastor to the nation, another Mormon, Glenn Beck, who has referred to the Park 51 project as an Allah tells me to blow up America mosque. There was at least one leading Mormon politician who spoke out for Muslims and the First Amendment. However, Orrin Hatch broke ranks not only with his fellow Mormon politicians, but also with his fellow Republicans, when he said he would be the first to come out in support for the project. Of course, he wasn't the first who did it, but why quibble over time? He called Islam a great religion, and he spoke out for the right of Muslims to build their community center near Ground Zero. I wanted to leave some time for questions, so I think James Davison Hunter, the author of that article that sets out this typology for the development, the inclusion of minority religions in America, from the sort of invisibility of introduction through recognition, negotiation, and legitimation or establishment. I think he's right to see these religions on that sort of path. But as Hunter himself recognizes, how minority religions navigate the path varies tremendously from group to group. Alongside their many similarities, Mormons and Muslims share a history of persecution in the United States. Mormons were persecuted first and foremost for their beliefs and practices concerning polygamy. Muslims are being questioned this week because of the jihadists and Islamists in their midst. But the acceptance of Muslims has been a long time coming. And despite the best efforts of President George W. Bush, who repeatedly spoke of Islam during his presidency, particularly after 9/11, as a religion of peace, who emphasized Americans were at war not with Muslims but with terror, despite those efforts, acceptance of Muslims has not yet been realized. While Mormons are, for many Americans at least, quintessentially American, Muslims remain widely mistrusted, stuck somewhere between recognition and negotiation. Mormons are now overrepresented in the US Congress. In other words, there's a greater percentage of them, about 3%, in the Congress than there are in the US population. Muslims are underrepresented, with Keith Ellison as their only voice on Capitol Hill. I have long argued that religious groups have a responsibility for rooting out the evils in their midst. When I was a professor at Georgia State University, I used to teach Nazi theology to my undergraduates. Some of them, actually their parents were alarmed that they had a professor who was teaching them Nazi theology. But the purpose of that was for them to see how Christians in the 1930s in Germany had connected the dots between the Bible, Christian teachings, and the extermination of Jews. And the way my students responded to those texts was, to me, frightening. And the way they responded was to say that Nazis weren't Christians, that no Christian would ever do the kinds of things that the Nazis did, because there's no basis for that in the Bible or in the Christian tradition. And there's something laudable about that sort of response, but there's something, to me, that's that's terrifying. What's laudable, of course, is the rejection in the name of Christianity of that kind of behavior and assault and murder. But what's frightening is the refusal to see in your own tradition the sort of resources there are for the pure persecution, denunciation, and murder of another religious group. We had a parallel argument after 9/11, where many Muslims said about the atrocities of 9/11, those people weren't Muslims, as if that was all that needed to be said. But the more appropriate response, and one we did hear from the American and global Muslim community, was that these people were Muslims, and they were drawing on resources in our tradition to do something that was despicable. And it's our responsibility to call attention to those resources and to address them and to point out the ways in which what they did was contrary to the Quran and to the Hadith and to the Muslim tradition. In other words, when faced with these situations, religious traditions have an opportunity either to wipe their hands of them and pretend that they have no responsibility for the so-called extremists in their midst, or to address the problem, both internally and externally. To his credit, the Pope has done that in his new book, reversing centuries of Roman Catholic teachings by arguing that the Jews are by no means culpable for the death of Jesus. Tremendously important development in Roman Catholicism. It's just happening within the last month. And many Muslims have done the same by denouncing the atrocities of 9/11, not only as violations of human rights, but as contrary to Islamic law and practice. So today, at this conference on Islam and Mormonism, I want to advance what I see as a parallel proposition to this idea that religious groups have responsibility for rooting out and exposing the resources for mischief and evil in their midst. And that is that religious groups that have been persecuted in the United States but have managed to negotiate their way into some measure of legitimation and establishment, and I would add power, bear a special burden to denounce the persecution of other religious minorities in the United States. Call it paying it forward, if you will, or backward, but it's time, in my view, for Mormons to step up, just as Japanese American Buddhists did after 9/11, and speak out against efforts by officials of the US government to do to Muslims what the government once did to Mormons not so very long ago. That's what I have. Do we have time for questions, or do we reserve that for the panel? Is that a yes or no? Okay. Okay, good. But I'd love to take a few questions. That sounds good to me, if we can do that. If there's any comments or questions. Yes, hi. Do we need the mic for this? Okay.
Yes, hold on. If you'll hold your question until the mic gets to you, and then that way we'll have the question and answer recorded. Thank you.
In your opinion, how much does race factor into this argument? Although the majority of Mormons are by no means white, they are seen as such in this country, while Muslims are not seen as such.
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I think that's definitely part of it. I think we have this perhaps natural tendency to be comfortable with people who seem like us, and one way people seem like us is by having the same skin color that we do. I know that Islam in the 60s and 70s was, to a great extent in America, associated with African Americans, and that was a problem and it was associated with the Nation of Islam. Because the high-profile Muslims we had in America were Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali now is cool, but he wasn't then. He was scary. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think it's always hard to separate these things out, because we don't have a world in which we have non-racial religious people that we can put in like a test and see how we react to them, non-racial Mormons or non-racial Muslims, and how non-racial Christians react to them. And it's the same problem with, how do you separate out religion and culture? Often people who want to either denounce religion or to come to its defense want to do that separation. They want to say, the atheists want to say, oh, well, that's religious mischief. It's not cultural mischief. And then the religious apologists want to say, no, that's cultural mischief. When the Muslims are doing this bad thing, or when the Christians are doing this bad thing, they're doing it as members of a cultural group. They're doing it as Saudis, or as Americans, or as Southerners. But I think that's definitely a part of it. I think that we have suspicion, continuing suspicion in America of people who are brown and black, and we have in the public perception more brown and black Muslims than we do white ones, and that's a scary proposition. Yeah, hi.
Hi. I've never been in New York. I'm not familiar with the area. I don't know exactly how far or how near to the ground zero this building wants to be built. My question is to you, from your point of view, and from an objective point of view, regardless of religion's freedom that obviously they have in this country, do you think that the building of this mosque is going to bring a lot of conflict, a lot of political conflict once it's built?
And you asked me to speak from an objective point of view? Is that what you asked me for?
Yes.
Oh, I can't do that. I'll just tell you. I'll speak from my point of view.
Okay.
My point of view is that it's striking what's happened the day the election was over. I think the day the election was over, there was a huge decline in the worry about the community center there, and it was pretty clear that this was an issue that was exploited for a purpose of the election. And this is very common. It's very common, and it's actually disturbing that in American society we have a tendency that goes back, I think, to the election of 1800 of anathematizing certain religious and ethnic groups for electioneering purposes. And I think that's a lot of what was going on. So I think that insofar as that is an issue, or the thing hasn't been built yet, or the thing has been recently built, when we have an election, we're probably going to hear more about it. So my guess is there will be conflict there. But I think there will be conflict about it. But this is where I would go back to Dr. Paul, that I don't know that conflict is necessarily bad. I think the idea that we should be somehow we're avoiding conflict by not building it. If the Muslims could just be kind of sufficiently people of goodwill to not create a disturbance among people who don't want to see Muslims in Lower Manhattan, then we would all be happy together. That seems to me like just a very strange logic. So I guess that's my two-part answer. Hi.
Hi. The why of this I find interesting. You have a minority group, Mormons, probably do not want to be perceived as minority. They want to be part of a majority, mainstream, seen as something important. And so why they are not stepping up as you want them to do, could this be related to the fact they do not want to be seen anymore as a minority, and that's an embarrassing path to them? Or is it something else in place? Why aren't Mormons stepping up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the explanation, although I think that's part of what was so brave and interesting about Romney's 2007 speech, was that he did position himself as a religious minority. So he made that move. He thought that was not political suicide in 2007. Maybe he believes the situation is different now. I think the issue goes back to this question that was raised before about identity. I think these Mormon Republican people in power are more Republicans than they are Mormons. I think that's the issue. I think if they took the time to see themselves as at least as Mormon as they were Republican, then they would do the right thing. They would do something different. but they understand that in their party right now, that the Islam question is sort of red meat. And again, this has been done a lot in America, so it's not contemporary Republicans vis-a-vis Muslims who are, this is an old game. But to stir up fear around a minority religion or a minority ethnic or racial group is, pretty like politics 101. And I think that that's what they're doing. They have the perception that they're going to gain votes from their base by doing this. I think it's really interesting to see what happened with Peter King on this, because the person who convened these hearings, that I think he had a sense that he was going to gain a lot from his base by doing this, and I don't think he realized how much he was going to lose also by doing it. And it was interesting to see how his rhetoric at least was ratcheted down a little bit, maybe 20% ratcheted down over the last couple days, in comparison when he was saying things like 80 to 85% of the mosques in America are controlled by Islamist, jihadist extremists. He didn't say that in the hearings yesterday. So that's the way I would put it. I think the explanation is, why aren't Mormons stepping up? Because they've become, at least the people in power, more faithful to their Republican politics than to their Mormon faith. Yes.
Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and reconvene a panel where you can ask more questions of Dr. Prothero and our two previous speakers.
If you'll join me in thanking Dr. Steven Prothero.